Hello, friends. I am Brett Stevens. I'm the discipleship pastor here at Gateway. And today we're going to be looking at our common thread devotional from the Gospels. And the Gospel reading this week is from the book of Mark, chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. So as we look at this verse, there's a lot of interesting things going on here. And so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. A couple of things that stand out to me. One, we have this strange interaction. So it starts off by telling us that the things that Jesus were doing were so bizarre that his family thought he had lost his mind. So remember, these are people who have been around for most of his life, and now he's off teaching about the kingdom of God, and they're feeling a little concerned, a little worried about him, and so they come to get him and bring him home, basically. And so that's how this passage starts, and then it ends with them standing outside. There's such a crowd they can't even get to him, and so they're like, hey, tell him to come out here and talk to us. And Jesus doesn't come out and talk to them. Instead, he gives this sort of cryptic teaching saying, who are my mother and brothers? They are the ones who do the will of God. Anyone who does the will of God, or anyone who obeys God, is my mother and brother and sister. But in the middle here is his teaching, which is also a little challenging because he explains how he's doing these miraculous things, and some people see it and they attribute it to the power of demons. They say, well, he can only do this because he has the power of demons. He's actually a demon-infested person himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to do these things. And Jesus gives this kind of strange teaching on the unforgivable sin and about the relationship to demons, and it's very strange. It's very distant to us because we don't have a lot of concept, a lot of interaction with dark spiritual power, at least not directly in our world today. Not here in the States. We don't see a lot of that. We don't think about it. It's kind of far removed from us, and so even his teaching, it's difficult to make sense of what do we do with this in our daily lives. And this is something, if I had more time, maybe we would dive into talking about the spirit world and spiritual powers and stuff like that. But I think that's something that just can get so complex that we don't have time to cover it in a short devotional. So instead, I want to focus here on Jesus' teaching about his mother and his brothers and his sisters who do the will of God. And so his family doesn't recognize and accept what he's doing. We know that they later come to accept who he is. In fact, his brother James becomes one of the predominant leaders in the Jerusalem church. But at this time, they don't really recognize who he is. And so they're trying to get him to chill out and come home and just kind of do what he's supposed to do, help take care of the family, do your job, whatever. But instead, he turns this into a moment to teach people. And the idea that he's teaching on here will later be expanded upon by Paul as talking about our adoption, that we are adopted into God's family. But the core point that he makes here is just this, that he has more kinship with people who do the will of God than with people with whom he shares a bloodline. And that is really an identifying concept for the church at large. The early church really embraced this idea, but you still see it even today, that the church brings together groups of people who otherwise probably wouldn't come together. They don't have as much in common necessarily, but through the power of God, we are all in agreement on some things that are so critical, so important to us, that all the other differences become a lot less important. This also touches on the idea that part of what was earned for us in the cross is not just that we are forgiven of sins, but that we actually become part of God's family, that he accepts us as his own. And this is a unique and special blessing. And it points to kind of the deeper reality of what Jesus was doing. That he didn't just come to forgive a bunch of people, to pay off debts, but that he came to sort of fundamentally change the relationship between humanity and God, that he wanted them to be family. And you see this especially in some of his prayers, like in the Gospel of John or that kind of thing, as he gets towards his time of death, that he thinks and looks ahead to this idea that he's drawing people to himself, that he is loving, he's a shepherd, he's a caretaker, that he wants to be kind and compassionate and close to us. And this stands sharply opposed to views of God as the sort of distant figure who is removed from the problems of the world. And so this is what the incarnation was about, and Jesus teaches about it here in Mark, that we can be adopted, that we can be part of God's family. And this is a beautiful thing. So I hope that as we come to this weekend, as we gather to worship, that you'll be excited to gather with your family, to worship your Father, that this idea of family, of closeness, of unity will be a blessing to you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.